Well, Howard Price in Norfolk, Virginia emails in. Recently, we have heard about financial institutions that have to receive government aid because they are, quote, too big to fail. If they are so important to our economy, why aren't they regulated as a public utility?
Give the man first prize because they should have been regulated. They were deregulated by both parties. They couldn't deregulate it fast enough. They couldn't create more abusing institutions. The Democrats' handiwork with all their power structure was Citigroup. This is a bank that's so bad that one of the fines it paid recently was because if you paid your credit card bill twice, they didn't refund the money. They came up with some program that swept it automatically into the profit structure. So they got fined. I think this was a big Democratic success story. They let Citigroup become the total mess that it was. Well, no, I'm off the track. What was my
public utilities?
Oh, public utility is what I would do to these people. Basically, my great-grandfather was the chief accountant. What did they call him? He was some title. He did that for the Reading Railroad in Pennsylvania in the 1890s. And the Reading Railroad had a major bankruptcy, and they had all this watered stock. So in 1893, they and a whole lot of other railroads became very unpopular, and everybody started to see, hey, these things ought to be utilities. They shouldn't be gambling casinos. So slowly but surely, and my great-grandfather stayed there until he retired in World War I. But during that period, the railroads went from being Wall Street casino operations in terms of their debt and how they handled anything to being regulated utilities. I think we have to take anything that is a repository of people's pensions, that handles accounts of ordinary people, and say, no speculating in here, baby, none of that. You have a hedge fund, they can be regulated in some other way, and if they fail, nobody cares. But if you're big enough to be that you can't fail, the second thing would be shrink them. And that was a great quote from either Nixon or Eisenhower, and it's, I don't remember which one, and I'd like to know. The answer was, if it's too big to fail, make them smaller. And I think that is the advice that should have been working in this country 10 years ago. None of these things should have been too big to fail, and 3 or 4 of them should have had marvelous technicolor failures in which the people that came up with all these great inventions saw it bite the dust, but they should have been kept small enough as opposed to be made huge so that the question you had to say, well, it can't fail. I sort of understand why they can't fail, but the people who let them get that big failed. It's only a question of who you say failed and who should fail. And they should all fail historically. They should all fail in the court of public opinion. But do you have to bail out the mess that Citigroup became? I suppose so. I suppose so. But the whole way this happened in the last 25 and especially 10 years should be a massive subject of investigation, congressional committee hearings, prosecutions and investigations by U.S. attorneys in places. Don't let this one die down because this is huge.
Next call for Kevin Phillips, Baltimore. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Speaking of investigations, when the Democrats won Congress in 2006, Nancy Pelosi took impeaching Bush off of the table. Now, former prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi has written a book called The Prosecution of George W. Bush for Murder. Bugliosi believes it would have been very difficult to impeach Bush, and I agree. It would have dragged on, and it would have interfered with the recent presidential election. But Bugliosi has promised to go after Bush as soon as he leaves the White House and charge him with murder against innocent Iraqis and the unnecessary deaths of our soldiers in a war that Bush knowingly lied us into. What are your comments, sir?
I wouldn't have minded seeing a seriously considered move to impeach Bush based on the lies about the war and misleading Congress and everything like that. But the Democrats were institutionally incapable of delivering something that was sober, sensible in that vein, because they've been part of a lot of the same stuff. Bill and Hillary Clinton had been there for all the weapons of mass destruction. I don't know whether Bush believed it. They shouldn't have, but I don't know whether they did. But certainly did lie about other things. The Democrats fell down on the job, like they fell down on the job of blocking crazy deregulation in the late 90s. The Democrats in Congress fell down on the job of dealing with George W. Bush. And I say that, and I will say that the Republican Party deserved to be thrown out of office because it became identified with two successive Bush presidents who compiled the biggest decline in job approval in American history, and the son actually beat the father. And the Republican Party was sitting there propping this stuff up. But because I'll say this, I have no hesitation in saying if the Democrats stood for something serious, as opposed to stood for all kinds of opportunisms in which they just played second fiddle when they were out of power, maybe they could have made a serious case. But I don't think they could have made a serious case because they were hamstrung by their own sort of secondary level involvement in it.
And in fact, in Bad Money, published in May of 2008, Kevin Phillips writes in the chapter The Politics of Evasion, which brings us to the question of how the party taking the White House in 2008 can manage the 2009 reform and reorientation of a culpable financial sector in the wake of a housing downturn unlikely to yet have hit bottom. If there is little reason to suppose that another Republican administration would know where to turn, there is not much more for expecting tough policy making, to say nothing of two-fisted re-regulation from a Democratic Party bitterly condemned by many of its own reformers in 2007 for lacking even a whisper of steadfastness. San Francisco, you're on with Kevin Phillips.
Yeah, wow. So I agree with just about everything you say about the Bushes and the Clintons and the financial sector. So I wanted to know what you thought about two seemingly distant but actually interlocking questions. On the financial sector, there's one area in which the financial sector really impinges on the manufacturing sector that isn't brought up much, mainly because it's considered a third rail that you can't really touch. Neither party, in fact, Obama had to take pains to distance himself from the idea that we might actually get the financial sector out of health care in terms of the insurance racket and go to a healthcare system like every other industrialized country in the world, either a Canadian-style single payer, or if you want to get really radical, a British-style national health. I think the Canadian style is probably more fitting to this country at this point. But Obama actually, took out a whole ad and played it heavily, saying, "No, we're not for that." And to me, I mean, if GM is spending more money on healthcare insurance, not on providing healthcare, but in paying off the insurance racket, than they pay on for steel, wouldn't it make sense to go to some kind of a single-payer system so they don't have to move all their plants north of the border?
Well, I think the caller really has his finger on a major aspect. It's a problem for an awful lot of old-line American business that they can't handle the whole benefit structure that they have. 40, 50 years after the heyday of American industry, you can't afford all the concomitants that come with a unionized workforce and the consequent structure of pensions and health benefits and so forth. But as people out listening may or may not know, Obama got $12.5 billion from the financial sector during 2008. McCain got $8. First time I can ever remember that a seriously powerful financial sector, the dominant sector of the U.S. economy, split and went Democratic. Now, there are elements of the Democratic Party are probably closer to the financial structures and intermediaries and money making in health and mortgages than they are to the other stuff. I don't have any sense, and caller's actually given me something I want to think about and maybe try to look into. what percentage of the huge gross domestic product of the financial sector involves health-related insurance? Because what you've really got is a growing portrait of the American debt industry as a major component of the financial sector, which includes credit card debt, household debt of a non-credit card variety, mortgage debt. Then you get auto loans. Now, I mean, that's a fair part of, that was what made money the longest in Detroit. They had the loans. And General Electric is half a financial company, and that was where they made more money than some of the other stuff for a while. It's going to be reversed now. But we should really try to get a sense of how much business in this country that's not known as finance really is, and to have an idea of the extent to which the financial sector's participation in health is an obstacle to serious reform. I'm perfectly willing, not that what I say matters, but perfectly willing to entertain that one of the major expenses involved in American healthcare is the fact that it's tied in with the financial sector.
Albert Jackson writes in, what's your observation about the past election of President-elect Obama's raising $750 million? Is that bad for campaign finance?
Oh, campaign finance has become something of a joke anyway. It's like a Swiss cheese, and if you close one of the holes, they go through another hole. And the whole thing depends in many ways on this flagrantly expansive construction of the constitutional support of free speech. And free speech, in the minds of a lot of people, would include passing a check. I mean, they would actually want that to be free expression. No, so I feel that the whole thing is corrupt. It's a Swiss cheese of influence peddling. I hope Obama is serious when he's telling us that he's going to be the big decider, and he won't decide for the power structure. Now, he didn't use the word decider, but I remember the last president who said he was the decider. You know, he wasn't qualified to decide the price of a hamburger at McDonald's. Now, I don't know what the new president's qualified to describe in terms of intellectual competence. I think a hell of a lot. But is he qualified to make decisions that go against the people who gave him $12.5 million to McCain's aid? I'm not so sure. He's got to prove that to me. He's got a White House chief of staff who was the chief recipient of Wall Street and financial industry money, even when he didn't have a serious opponent. Rahm Emanuel. People in Chicago that hear the idea that Obama's a reformer, you know, they laugh so much you think they had laughing gas, because you're not exactly looking at reform Illinois with Obama. And I hope I'm wrong. I voted for him partly based, you've got to get the Republicans out, but secondly, because of his personal intelligence and credibility. And I don't intend to hector this administration. I'm too old to do this again, and I did it with the Bushes. If he backs up and he doesn't support the people against the money, he ain't going to get away with it.
Harvey Fried or Freed emails, I'm enjoying your in-depth interview, but am concerned that your apprehension about both political parties might indicate some questioning of a free market republic form of government. Any comment on this?
Oh, I certainly question the free market Republican form of government. One of the things I protested, and you mentioned there's a chart in bad money. The Republicans give lip service to free market principles, but when somebody in the financial industry needs a bailout, you never saw socialists arrive more quickly with a bigger treasure chest. The notion that we have a free market economy with respect to finance is total nonsense. Every time they get in trouble, they get bailed out. It doesn't matter what it is. I mean, I've got a list of 12 of these things in the book, and it's not even trying to cover the minor ones. They bail out everything that moves. And they're not accused of this, because I want you to tell me, all of you out there, what's the name of the second party that bails them all out whenever they need it? That's right. So why isn't this a big issue? And why don't we have all this free market pretense that they stand for this? They don't.
Kevin Phillips, it was recently reported that the unemployment rate in the U.S. went up to 6.8% in November of 2008, 500,000 plus jobs lost. When you hear those figures, those stats, what do you think?
I think that it would be more realistic if the government, instead of publishing what they call the U3 series, published the U6 series. The U6 series just went up to 12.5%. And that includes people who are stopped looking for a job, part-timers, all the caveats they use to keep it as low as possible. The number that the media use is by no means the most problem-reflecting number. They use a number that tends to understate things, and the U6 is the number that's more like a European computation, and we like to talk about how we have much lower unemployment than the Europeans. Well, that's because we don't use U6. U6 right now is 12.5%. That's probably pretty close to what a number of the European countries are.
What's U3, U6?
U3, these are the unemployment series, and U3 is a very narrow definition. And U6 is a very broad definition. And that's all the difference. But the government, in essence, says unemployment is U3, and U6 is an alternative series. I don't know why. We should tell people what the two represent, and the media should get off there taking the feed and do a little bit of work. And I've started to see New York Times was talking about, they didn't say U6, but they used the number. It was 12.5. Let's get a little statistical honesty going in this country.
Well, in Harper's, recently you wrote that based on the criteria in place a quarter century ago, today's U.S. unemployment rate is somewhere between 9 and 12%. The inflation rate is as high as 7 or even 10%. Economic growth since the recession of '01 has been mediocre, despite a huge surge in the wealth and incomes of the super rich, and we are falling back into recession. You also talked about in that article how U.S. presidents manipulated the numbers.
What one fellow involved in running a shadow statistics operation, the name of John Williams, refers to as Pollyanna creep. And this is the infusion of little games and all the different numbers. Now, for example, we have the National Bureau of Economic Research declares that the country is in a recession. Well, interestingly enough, the federal government's GDP numbers did not make that case. Why? Because with the accuracy of the GDP numbers in a dollar, you can get a chocolate bar. The GDP numbers consist of a whole bunch of things. They have imputed income, which includes things like the benefits you get from a company, not just salary. They impute for the value of your house, but if you rented it, you know, its rental is imputed as income. Then they have something called the life and death of businesses. This is the change in business creation, which then feeds an X factor into the computation, and it's generally seen as not reflecting current, and it's in there as a lagging number. And then you get what they call a deflator, and this is it's their estimate of inflation. It's hilarious because their estimate of inflation usually bears no relationship to the estimate that's actually come out of their numbers. And I don't even think their numbers are legit because they understate it. But the deflator understates the numbers they have that understate it. So you've got these layers of nonsense in here. And it's half of it's a political science exercise because you have to define all these things, and they have little fudge factors in there. So the National Bureau of Economic Research couldn't use government data to determine whether we were in a recession, because government data is not designed to show us in a recession. Government data is designed to show us not there yet. And it's designed to show that the economy is still ticking along, so that all the people that may think the economy's in recession should blame themselves and not the government, because if they weren't losers, they wouldn't be in that situation. In point of fact, they're not losers, and they're in the situation because the government lies to them.
Eugene, Oregon, you're on with Kevin Phillips.
Thank you to C-SPAN, and thank you to Mr. Phillips. Great conversation. I would hope that the question is taken and answered fully. What is your timeline for a third party, and do you believe it'll happen soon, or is there a tipping point that we can look forward to, people like myself who would love to see a third party? Thank you.
And I would note that we have received several emails similar to that.
Well, I liked the idea of a third party when it came up with Ross Perot. Now, the difficulty with Ross Perot, in some ways he was a pretty sober citizen, is that somewhere in there a wire that should have gone to an A terminal went to a B terminal, and it didn't all work out exactly. But the big difficulty, he had a shot because he had all the money and he had the wherewithal to institutionalize something, and it didn't really do a good job. He lost what was a big opportunity. And the Democrats, as long as Perot seemed credible, thought maybe they had to preempt a lot of what he said, but since he didn't seem credible for too long after, they didn't. Now, I think at this point it's awfully difficult to imagine a third party nationally. It's conceivable that an independent candidacy, as opposed to an institutionalized third party, could, if the two parties are sufficiently discredited. Now, if the Democrats mess up these 4 years, Obama is going to be held to a high standard because he is intelligent. And he has a background of smarts and intelligence. And if he's basically can't do anything because the Democrats have been rented by a lot of the same people who rented the Republicans, well, I think you're going to get another round of why do to make this appalling choice all the time. But I don't know who the independent candidate would be. Bloomberg, Mayor Bloomberg in New York, I fancied himself in that role, but it didn't present itself this time. I can conceive of something presenting itself, but I can't imagine it to be an institutionalized third party. I mean, in some ways, we've already got too many. There should be something that creates fluidity here. It's not that we need a third party. We need real fluidity so that somehow or other you can take this crowd that's institutionalized in Washington on both sides and shake them up. And I really don't know what it is.
What was the American Political Report?
American Political Report was a newsletter that I put out for 28 years, beginning in 1971, and I was actually planning to get rid of it by about 1995 or 96 because I hoped to move up to Connecticut, and we didn't move until like 97, 98, and then I got rid of it. But essentially, it was my analysis, for which, through the 1990s, it was a pretty good market. And I had a second publication called Business and Public Affairs Fortnightly, which was in essence on business-government relations. And that did pretty well too. And ultimately, by late 1980s and early 1990s, I was much more into books. And I had also been from the end of 79 through, I guess it was 1990, a consultant for several Wall Street firms, go around speaking about investment-related politics and political economics. So I was sort of moving off the newsletter business and figured I'd get rid of it all when we moved, but I actually got rid of the Business and Public Affairs Fortnightly before we moved, and I don't miss it.
Of your 13 books, what's your favorite?
My personal favorite is The Cousins Wars, because that was my therapy. That was the way I got away from having to think about how could the United States be run by Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich. What did that say about the country? I'd rather not think about it. So instead, I got to think about Oliver Cromwell and George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. And basically, those are three people who deserve to be in the history books. I mean, some of these people that we have now deserve to be in nothing. And that's why I want to go back to 1775. I need a period of time in which I'm not thinking about all these people.
And that's the book you're working on currently?
That I'm about to start.
San Diego, California, go ahead.
Good morning, or it's morning here, afternoon there. My real passion is the concentrated ownership of the media. You know, when Reagan took office, there were about 80 media company owners. Today, there are about 5. The Telecommunications Act of the mid-'90s deregulated that and allowed that to happen, which probably served to do great damage to the freedom of the press and the First Amendment. And look at talk radio. The content is 91% conservative. So my question is, how can we have an informed electorate if the press is generally serves to cheerlead for flawed or corrupt policies promulgated by the executive branch? And do you feel this is a problem? And if so, what can we do about it?
Well, I don't see a good solution because in terms of the blandness and sort of establishmentarian no-think and then don't cover anything outside between the 40-yard line on one side and the 40-yard line on the other side, that's the major national media. They really have very little interesting to say, in my opinion. And from time to time, the New York Times makes an effort, and sometimes the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post and the LA Times score a little something. I mean, you might as well almost not even watch the 3 networks, the old ones, the commercial networks. Talk radio is so heavily conservative, it's created itself as a genre that substitutes for one part of the old crazy press, as it were, the ones that were always calling for something or starting a war. You used to have, in the days of the Hearsts and the Pulitzers and so forth, newspapers on both sides that were idiosyncratic and independently owned, and we've lost that. I wish there was something that had very expressive people on both sides pushing stuff, and the right-wing talk shows, I basically don't think much of. It's surprising again to me that the liberals can't come up with more than what they do, and I think it's because very few of them, the programs that thrive represent more of a left audience, and you can thrive with that. But the liberals have not figured out how to take a centrist politics that has verve. And you know, I come back and like I have zero interest in talk radio. I don't even like to be on it. But if you attack both sides, my feeling is there's a hell of an audience out there for that, you know. And now you can expect to be screwed by the Democrats, but remember, for 8 years, the Republicans you may be turning to for an alternative, you were screwed by them. So it's a problem, folks, and here's A and B and C and D that you won't hear from either the right-wing talk kooks or some of the liberals who are one-sided themselves. I don't know how you do this, and I don't know who would basically want to do that. It's hard for me to see, because if you were taking both sides, the premium isn't on an impassioned thing, but I think you can, I mean, my blood pressure will be better for a week after this show, because all the stress that I've used up describing these creeps is going to be out of my system, and maybe that would work, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't do a program like that. I couldn't stand it.
Who's your favorite American president?
Oh, the one that of the ones I remember, my favorite is Eisenhower. Everybody, they used to call him Dopey Dwight. It's pretty good period, and he was pretty respected. And he did have all those great things to say about how bankrupt the two-party system is, and his attack on the military-industrial complex, and he was a lot more than just a general. On the other hand, I think Roosevelt did a pretty good job, FDR, and I think Teddy did a pretty good job. Once you get me back into the 19th century, I tend to slide towards Republicans, and then in the early 19th century towards Andrew Jackson and such like Democrats. So if I came up with my top 6 or 8, it would be very much across parties. But of the recent crowd, you know, Nixon obviously destroyed his memory. Johnson did the same thing to himself. In my opinion, Clinton really did too. Carter was sufficiently incompetent on certain things so that his basic intelligence got lost. Gerald Ford didn't matter very much. Reagan was a nice guy, and I think it was a net plus to have him in there, but I'm well aware of the downsides. And of course, I wrote a book about the Bushes, so we know I'm not thinking about them in that category. I'm not a happy camper.
St. Clair Shores, Michigan, you're on with Kevin Phillips.
Hello, Mr. Phillips. I'm a big fan of yours. What I wanted to talk to you about earlier, you were talking about companies too big to fail. What do you think about bringing back the Sherman antitrust laws and busting up these monopolies so there's not companies too big to fail?
Well, the big to fail thing doesn't really apply beyond finance, and they become too big to fail because of the impact on the financial system, which is a coverall basically for the financial power structure. Now, nobody's used too big to fail on Detroit. It's just a question of whether or not it would have too much effect on the system and unemployment and a more generic thing. Whoever said, and there was a consciousness in the United States up until the 1930s and especially through World War I of breaking up big concentrations. Now, I think that got exaggerated in terms of, I don't have that much to say negative, quote unquote, about big oil, General Electric, or the big companies of the 30s and 40s and 50s. They were reasonably tightly regulated by a whole lot of different types of laws. This was an era of regulation. It was an era when the Democratic coalition stood for regulation with the people in mind as opposed to for their particular brand of contributors in mind half the time. I don't think we can bring back the whole antitrust approach, but I would certainly be in favor in terms of the financial sector. Bust it up before it gets too big so you no longer have things that are too big to fail, because in some respects it's putting all the stuff back under one tent that enabled them to, they had more kinds of carnival backers and find the walnut with the pea in it and all this going in one structure than they ever had before. They could make it and then sell it, which they couldn't do under Glass-Steagall. So this was totally flawed, and again, a total handiwork of conservatives, but including Democratic Wall Streeters. And now we have to watch out for them. I wouldn't have any faith in a too big to fail and antitrust doctrine that came from Clinton Democrats, because they have been part of the deregulation that's produced the problems. Now, is there some way you can take out the more populist elements in the Republicans and the genuinely free market people together with the progressive Democrats? I'd really like to see that. I don't know how you do it, but in some ways it's out there. It was the coalition that won on the bailout. And when I looked at that, I thought, geez, I hope they can vote again some more, somehow that can happen.
Yes, sir. You've been very critical of the Bushes. I wonder if you have a personal vendetta against them. Did they leave you out of the administration at some point?
No.
They seem like nice people to me.
I think they probably are in some respects nice people. I think I said that George H.W. was a very pleasant guy. Now, Barbara is not very pleasant. People in the media have this conversation all the time. The whole Pearl and Dog Act is not exactly what she's all about.
What do you mean by that?
I mean that she's not exactly Grandma Sweetness. She's a little bit of a tough cookie. No, I was out of sync with the Republicans by the time the first Bush took office. Nothing to do with anything. I sometimes feel bad that people say George H.W. was really personable if you know him. I just happen to think he's been an appalling president. That's my yardstick. It doesn't matter to me whether he would have been fun to be in a second string fraternity with. That doesn't matter. Was he a useful president at this point in time? Capital N, capital O. That's my yardstick. George H.W., a little bit of a different story. Barbara, one time, first time I ever had anything to do with a woman, and I'd written something critical of her husband. This was like 1970 or something. And at some party, I don't think I'd met her before, but I'm not sure. She comes up to, how dare you write that about my husband? That was Barbara. So Did I always remember that? Yes, I remember. I sort of agreed with people who had certain doubts about her personality, and I like George H.W. He shouldn't have been president, and George H.W. shouldn't have been anything. My vendetta, and people are fair to say that. I think it's appalling that this country had to have those people in the White House. If that's a vendetta, it's a historical vendetta.
And finally, Mr. Phillips, Ed Smith from Fort Walton Beach, Florida writes in, "It is time for a new book from you. I give to you a new title." And he proposes Prelude to the Fall, How Greed and Apathy Killed Democracy.
Oh, well, a revised issue of Bad Money is coming out in the spring. And it's revised in the sense that the main body of what's in there now stays in there because it was a pretty good analysis, and people have said it was sort of like some of the people that wrote about the Depression before it happened. You didn't have to read anything new. You could get it out of the previous one. But this, the coming one, the edition that comes out in the spring, will have, probably roughly 80 new pages which catch up on all this. I don't want to have to write it again. I really want to go to 1775 when I can think about people who are remembered on stamps and coins, and an honest guy like Washington who didn't make any money out of it. I mean, believe it or not, the man did not take any money. Can you imagine an American politician who didn't take money today? Whether it was a deal with a broadcast set or football team set up, or LBJ making all the money out of his wife's TV station, or Clinton, or anybody. I'm sorry, I want to go back. I don't want to have judgment on Obama. Give him his 2 years or 3 years or whatever. Let people, I spent the last 4 elections writing books that I think raised serious issues, and they had some impact, but they didn't change anything. Let the Democrats who know about the Democratic Party write about how true this administration is to its promises. I did my thing with the Republican family that I thought was a waste of time. I give it to somebody else to do with the Democrats.
To get a list of Kevin Phillips' books or to watch this interview, go to booktv.org. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.